Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
When you start getting out into the open, some of the terrible consequences of the nuclear weapons. You know, Jonathan Schell's book, The Fate of the Earth, is probably something that's done that for many people, but that one example keeps coming to my mind, that the Russians have 113 20-megaton bombs, and one 20-megaton bomb dropped over New York City obliterates the whole thing. People out in the open 23 miles away are burned to death. People 100 miles away might be blinded if they're looking that direction. I mean, it's just, when you start thinking of that, indeed it is a whole new situation. You know, and the bishops are, I think, picking up that thing and saying, we've got to rethink now. We can't just go along in the old patterns. And I really think they are doing something courageous.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Dan Ring, pastor of St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon, Ohio. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of an introduction to the bishop's pastoral letter. Here's Father Bacik.
Dan, I'm glad you took time out from a busy schedule to come and speak with me about a matter of great importance, and that is the bishop's pastoral letter on the whole question of peace, which is entitled The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise and Our Response. This pastoral has been much in the news of late. Statement by the Catholic bishops on the whole nuclear question, been a lot of controversy around it, and I think it would be good if we would discuss it a bit.
Thank you, Jim, for inviting me. The discussion will probably go in many directions because it's a long letter, covers a great deal of the gospel and how that might be interpreted in the face of a major crisis for the human race.
Yes, that's what gives it its great significance, I suppose. Well, you and I have been involved in trying to do a little promotion of study on this document. We had some study days for the Catholic priests of the Diocese of Toledo, in which we were trying to get some ideas out about the pastoral letter to educate the clergy to begin with. I know you were part of that, and I did a bit on that, and so we've been thinking about this, at least. I thought that was a good idea for us to do in our diocese, and I think that perhaps the people around our diocese are going to be hearing the priests preaching on this topic as we go along, and a lot of study and discussion.
Well, I think the willingness to listen to what the bishops are thinking is pretty high. I think people are deeply concerned the last 3-4 years particularly about what our future is in regard to war and nuclear weapons.
I was talking to a professor recently who I had invited to a luncheon where I was going to talk about this document, and he said to me, well, I'm not Catholic, I'm not sure why you invited me to this luncheon, and I said, well, I really think that the document has a larger significance than that. I mean, I think it really is of great interest. I noticed the news programs are carrying it, and Nightline, for example, has done a couple of programs on it. And so my response to him was that, you know, it is just a way of getting at a question that is obviously of great concern to all of us, the whole problem of nuclear warfare and peace in our world.
Well, the bishops have the last 20, 30 years tried to address men and women of goodwill who may not have Christian faith. And I think that happens because the problems they're addressing are institutional and social problems that all of us are involved in. And over the past 100 years, perhaps longer, Catholic thought has tried to base its preaching of the gospel and social concerns in an idiom that is a little wider as far as being understood. Not always religious terms, simply religious terms, but more philosophical terminology. For example, the idea of the dignity of the human person, I don't think Catholics own that at all. In fact, I don't think it even arose in Catholic thought primarily, but perhaps in Protestant and philosophical thought 400 or 500 years ago. And we've picked it up because it certainly reflects the gospel to us. So the language we use is meant to touch the hearts and the minds of of other people, not because we alone possess the truth, but because we're trying to work together in a world that we share.
Yeah, I think the bishops made that point in their document that they are hoping to make a contribution to the public debate. I think they think it's important that as we talk about questions of national defense and nuclear warfare, international relationships, that a moral dimension be brought into the discussion. I suppose when a lot of us think back to something like the Pentagon Papers in relationship to Vietnam, it's very distressing that in all of those debates that one didn't hear moral questions raised. And I think that perhaps a little bit of that experience is in our mind as we go about this. Again, it is not a claim to be exclusive teachers on this issue, but to be part of the debate. And, I think our bishops and the whole Catholic community has a right to do this. And I would like to see it as sort of an all-encompassing debate, that really no one's ruled out of it, that public policy is the concern of all of us. We can't just leave it to experts, can't just leave it to governmental officials. We live in a democracy, and it seems important that we try to bring in various viewpoints into this debate. And one of the specific things the bishops offer is the moral dimension. And of course, they're not loath to speak out of their own Christian heritage as they address it. But I think, as you well said, it sort of functions at two levels. At one level, they're trying to say general kinds of human principles that a lot of people might buy into. And in other cases, they're speaking specifically out of the gospel and what they think that tells us about question of nuclear warfare.
I'd like to hear you say something, Jim, about the idea of moral principles that have a contribution to play to the public debate. I think many people react when you say the word moral in maybe two ways. One of them is that morality has to do with private behavior, or perhaps a second reaction is that morality tends to be an abstract principle that you stand on when you haven't got anything practical to stand on.
That's a good observation. I think maybe together we can work on that question a bit here. I mean, one of my own senses is that our ethical behavior overflows into the social realm. That I think that it is really narrow to think that morality is confined to the private area, because even at a common sense level, the kind of decisions we make about our private lives often do affect the larger world. And the thing that we're learning more and more these days is that the cultural condition, the social structures, the systems in which we live have a whole lot to do with how our private morality is lived out. It just seems to me what we have learned is more deeply that we are social creatures, that we are institutional creatures. And so what our government does in terms of nuclear policy has a lot to do with the unemployment question, for example. And then it has a lot to do with how people privately respond to that, how they try to keep their own heads together while relatives are out of work or while they're out of work. So, I mean, it just is so interdependent, it seems hard for me to think that today people want to think of morality just in private or individualistic terms, although that clearly is a dimension of it. Of course, from our own perspective, I think what we see on that question is that this insistence that the gospel has a social dimension, that what Jesus taught has ramifications in the economic, social, political order. There is a sort of horizontal dimension to morality that extends out to our relationships with our neighborhood, our country, and finally to our world. That what Jesus has preached, love of neighbor has ramifications in the institutional order. And so I think that the gospel, again, moves us into this more communal type of morality. Well, I mean, how can you make that just really clear? I mean, some father here who's worried about his child growing up in a safe world has to be concerned with this nuclear question. We know these kids are worried about it, that it's affecting their psychic life. One of the things we're finding out, a lot of these youngsters are worried about the threat of the bomb. I mean, to see a 12-year-old kid on television talking about organizing other kids in order to fight against the use of nuclear weapons and trying to talk to kids in Soviet Union and so on to bring them into a coalition, well, that is a startling and shocking kind of thing, to think that youngsters of that age need to be concerned with this question. So somebody who's sitting there saying, well, this is just a private moral issue, isn't looking at the larger kind of questions. It seems very clear to me here.
The young have a deep sense of justice sometimes that contributes to the common good. I wonder, the analogy of I think so much of our experience in regard to justice questions comes out of World War II, and the Holocaust event is one of those kinds of things that happened that was institutionalized genocide, injustice, and yet I think after the war, with the Nuremberg hearings and all those events of the German people coming to terms and ourselves coming to terms with what happened, you realize how institutional injustice interfaces with personal decisions and human death and life. At any point where you can say that politics had something to do with the death of someone, I think you also have something, you can say that the gospel has something to do with the life of someone.
Oh, that's well put. I think you're right that clearly the Holocaust experience still is in our consciousness, and we've in many ways not come to terms with it, but it sharpens this issue so much. And much of the theological thinking done in Germany and then which spread to Latin America and has come to our own country is based precisely on that experience, that saying where was the institutional response to this massive and unbelievable kind of evil. And I think in our own country, too, the Vietnam experience has been part of all of this. And so we really are, I guess, in this crisis kind of situation. The bishops picked up that statement out of Vatican II that we must have an entirely new appraisal of war because of the development of nuclear weapons. It's like a new ball game that's going on, and that we have to think of it differently. I'm thinking of that quote from Einstein. I don't think it's going to come to me exactly, but it's something like that the nuclear thing has changed everything except our mode of thinking, our consciousness, and therefore we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. Einstein was telling us a long time ago that we're going to have to rethink our world as a result of the nuclear threat. And it's when you start getting out into the open, some of the terrible consequences of the nuclear weapons. Jonathan Schell's book, The Fate of the Earth, is probably something that's done that for many people, but that one example keeps coming to my mind, that the Russians have 113 20-megaton bombs, and one 20-megaton bomb dropped over New York City obliterates the whole thing. People out in the open 23 miles away are burned to death. People 100 miles away might be blinded if they're looking that direction. It's just, when you start thinking of that, indeed it is a whole new situation. And the bishops are, I think, picking up that thing and saying, we've got to rethink now. We can't just go along in the old patterns. And I really think they are doing something courageous. I might as well say right here, I'm supporting this document. I think it is a good document. I think it is prudent in many ways, and I also think it is courageous to speak out these moral principles. The bishops are going to take a lot of heat on this. A lot of people aren't going to like it that they're putting their nose into political, economic, military kinds of matters. And I think, let's face it, in some ways they are opposing governmental policy. Whatever we read in the press these days on that question, some of the things that they say fly in the face of the kinds of strategies that we have adopted as a country. And therefore, I think that it is not only a good document, and I think in many ways a prudent one, but a courageous one.
I read a remark just recently that commented that the preacher that flatters his congregation and keeps them comfortable does them no service whatsoever. I think it's probably bishops as preachers and teachers that need to shake and disturb our conscience and realize that comes from a motive of working for truth and working for human beings, and not to create a political movement or a political party themselves. I think it's clear that that's not in the Church's agenda. We may have done that centuries ago, and we know the foolishness of it.
I think in your early comment there about the priest in the pulpit, and this is where it's going to come down to whether the religious leaders of the country are willing to enter into this whole debate and to raise the questions. I think it's probably good here at the outset of talking of the document that there is an authority question here that probably has to be looked at. That is, what kind of standing does this document have for the Catholic community? Now, I think for the larger secular community, that is fairly clear to me. It's going to either make an impact depending on how well it's argued and how well it's presented and how well they've done their homework and so on. I mean, that's a wide open kind of question. It really isn't an authority question in any way, I don't think. But what we've got here is a question within the Catholic community, what kind of authority it has. And I think that one of the statements that makes sense to me is to say, well, you've got to distinguish out within the document. That is, there are some universal principles that are stated there that seem to call forth a yes from all of the Catholic community, that we are to be peacemakers, that war is not an answer to our problems, that you can't directly include to killing of non-combatants, you know, you can't be targeting civilian populations, all of those kind of things. I think that are more universal in a sense, probably call forth an affirmation from the Catholic people. When you get down to more specific things about policy, perhaps then there's room for clear dissent. Although I think that right away you ought to say, well, I'm supporting the document. I think to maintain a consistent, progressive, liberal position, have to give the right to dissent to this document. I mean, I think some Catholic people are just going to say, no, they disagree with it. They think the bishops are not thinking clearly, that they've misapplied the gospel and so on. And I believe that we have to say, yeah, that's a very possible, good, sincere Christian response. And dissent is in order.
The right to dissent is a selective one. It's not a general one in the Church. It's more like we stand in relation to the teaching Church as learners, and the right to dissent, I think, would be based on the fact that we have some rational and theologically or biblically based alternative, and not just an unwillingness to deal with the question, or out of either prejudice for some kind of almost warmongering attitude, or even on the opposite, a pacifist position that ends up being irresponsible for the public good. Mm-hmm. Both can be, I think, irrational and not always a valid base for mm-hmm. dissent because it's not been thought through in the basis of the teaching Church.
So you're suggesting that the Catholics in the United States have to be thinking seriously about this, that one can't just out of hand reject it on sort of nationalistic principles, but that if one is going to move in another direction, that it ought to be based on some sort of value system that we find in the Gospels. I think that point's well taken.
In a democracy especially, that's our opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Dan, let's look a little bit more here at some of the things they're talking about in the first chapter of this document. They're talking about peace and the kingdom, and one of the ideas that strikes me there is they want a very positive notion of peace. They don't want peace just to be something that comes from a standoff between the superpowers, but peace has to flow from a just ordering of things. Peace has got a positive kind of notion to it, where there is justice and harmony and mutuality and so on. And I think that's valuable. They say that this work for peace can't be distinguished out from the quest for justice. And so we're not going to have peace in our world until we have people who are fed, and we have grievances that are redressed, and where we've dealt generally with the poverty problem, and where nations have found a way to live interdependently. So justice is a crucial part to what they're saying here, I think.
The justice question, I think in the last years of our Church, we've emphasized in order to restore a kind of ethic of love that Jesus Christ taught, and to get away from a legalism. Sometimes we've heightened the ethic of love to the point that it becomes the sole vision of what our life as Christians is. But the love that Jesus preached certainly is based first on a just relationship, a kind of mutual respect. I think it's the foundation, the possibility, the condition for the possibility of love is treating each other as persons and not violating their humanity.
And so that we have people in the world who are suffering unjustly, who don't have their proper share of the world's goods, people living in totalitarian situations where there's no dissent and so on possible, then all of this is going to create a difficult situation for peace. We can't really talk about peace in a situation like that, where we have to first try to redress the grievances and make sure that people have their rights. That would become the basis for this more positive notion of peace that we think that Jesus Christ has brought. Again, to bring in the Christian dimension, we're called by Jesus Christ to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, he says, and he says to put away the sword, and he suggests that a whole other way of interacting with people is possible.
The theology that's unveiled is one that looks for the kingdom of God at the end of time, but realizes that in Christ his kingdom has already come partially, and the process of its coming in history is our task, with God's grace. And I think that helps to clarify, we're not just going to wait for the final judgment. We have the beautiful capacity to form under God's grace and the call of the gospel a just community, a peaceful community now.
Right, but we'll only know it at the end time. It's a very realistic approach the bishops take. They remind us that sin and grace co-determine the human situation throughout. We're not going to create a utopia here on this earth. We're going to be continuing to struggle against injustice all throughout human history, but that the seeds of the kingdom are planted, and we look for its fulfillment only at the end time. Seems to me that's a very healthy perspective for being able to work hard for peace, but realizing that maybe our efforts are not going to be totally successful as we go along. Dan, can we look now at the whole moral choice question that they put in front of us? The bishops really divide their approach into two parts that they see in the Christian tradition. Now, they see a pacifist approach and they see a just war theory. I mean, just to sketch those out briefly, the pacifists claim that Jesus Christ taught total nonviolence and that the use of violence is always wrong and that it is ruled out immediately. On the other hand, the just war theory suggests that at times, for very extreme cases, that the use of force may be in order, and that even at times war could be justified in order to achieve greater good. So we have people arguing out of both of those traditions. So let's just take a minute to look at this nonviolent approach here and so on. We find that in the tradition, the Church Fathers, Francis of Assisi was nonviolent. We have some people in our modern world who took that stance, Martin Luther King being a good example, Dorothy Day, people who have said no to all violence. There are just going to be other ways to deal with life's problems.
I'm impressed by the fact that the bishops have caught the positive value of that pacifist position, that it is a very active involvement with the injustice, and it is a commitment to stop it, but it is a commitment to stop it without participating and building the same institutional injustice that we're fighting against. I think there's a pragmatic element that's new for us to recognize, that in pacifism there is an attempt to bring the conscience of the opponent to some kind of a conversion. I don't think Jesus talked much about that. I think the practical experience of pacifists, of Gandhi and the ones you mentioned, is that it brings people to as the victim is brought to the knees, oftentimes the oppressor likewise bends to meet in humanity that person who's been harmed.
Many people have seen that, as you suggested, in the life of Mohandas Gandhi as portrayed in the recent film called Gandhi, where they've seen the pragmatic value of the pacifist approach. And exactly as you said it, I think, that the hope is not to defeat the oppressor, not to defeat the opponent, but to help change consciousness both on the part of the oppressed and the oppressor. And perhaps that is something that we're seeing, at least in the civil rights movement, at least sometimes that was attempted, and I think we saw some results with it. So I think that we really do have to bring that out. I noticed that I heard a Harvard professor talking not long ago out of a totally no religious connection at all, but just saying that he was thinking that maybe pacifism had to be tried on pragmatic grounds, precisely because other things weren't working. that we had to find other conflict resolution techniques rather than force and violence and ultimately war.
Oftentimes scientists have moved sometimes towards a pacifist position, and bright people like Bertrand Russell and Einstein. I saw a clip of Einstein's life recently where he mentioned that if 5% of the people did take a pacifist position, that the war as we know it couldn't be waged. That kind of, the impact of that 5% would change the way we think about defense and war in the modern world.
I think it's important to see that this is a development within Catholic thought, and it has certain ramifications that we have sort of resurrected this notion in the modern world, and it would suggest things like the Catholic Church supporting conscientious objectors, of saying that it is possible to be selectively against a given war because one is working out of Christian principles, but that it's also possible to be against all war on Christian principles, and that therefore a conscientious objection has to be morally established. Our country needs to go along with that, and of course, which we do across the board. An objector does not have to serve in the army if he is opposed to all war. So I think what we're getting here is a sort of practical spin-off of that whole pacifist kind of position, and it is a real important development. It's important for us to celebrate, I think, the pacifists in our midst, that they really tell us important things. Dan, you know, we have not saved enough time to talk about this just war theory, but just to briefly say what people do in that theory is to argue out of proportionality. That is, they try to see does the war attain more good than all of the evil attendant to it, the killing of people and the destruction of property and so on. And of course, some people arguing out of that kind of proportionality theory would say nuclear war could never be justified. Other people want to say, well, yeah, there could be cases where you would do it. But for the purposes of the document, the bishops do adopt the just war posture. They argue out of those principles rather than the pacifist ones. Although I think it's marvelous that they celebrate pacifism and recognize it as part of the church and thank the people who are into that. But their own mode of arguing is a more concrete and sort of down-to-earth approach of saying proportion. Can nuclear warfare be justified when we think of all of the problems involved? Well, many more things to be said, but perhaps we'll just leave it at that.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Dan Ring, pastor of St. Ignatius Parish in Oregon. The topic of this week's Reflections was an introduction to the Bishop's Pastoral Letter. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.